Hey class, so we are nearing the end of the unit. Today we're going to be looking at 5.11, Challenges of Contemporary Agriculture. So as you can see, we're right here nearing the end. This objective kind of covers a lot in pretty broad terms, but essentially we're going to be looking at some agricultural advances that deal with the green revolution, like biotechnology, GMOs, and so on, and some of the challenges that accompany that. Also, patterns of consumption and how people have responded to them through different movements, and also challenges involving distribution of food. So first, actually, let me move myself over here. Here we go. So for biotechnology and agriculture, the thing about biotechnology is that there are absolutely positives, but there are downsides as well. So if we take a look at the pros, overall, biotech has allowed agriculture to produce higher yields, right? So basically more food in that same plot of land, and then also just better quality crops, so more of the crop is viable. In terms of cons, we see environmental damage that includes water pollution as well as contaminants in soil, a reduction in biodiversity, and also some risks to human health. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail moving forward. So for GMOs, this one's an interesting one because they're somewhat controversial, but essentially GMOs, these are just genetically modified organisms, when scientists kind of tweak the DNA of different plants to be more resistant to harm, to grow in larger size, things like that. And overall, they increase agricultural production. But I guess some downsides include that plants can be more susceptible to diseases, in that when you have an over-reliance on a single crop, on a monocrop, and if there's a disease or some sort of I guess an infection, you can almost call it, that affects that particular variety of that plant, then you have a big problem, right? Then you don't have that food security, because then if that crop were to become infected, then that would wipe out that whole crop, right? So essentially, these plant diseases are then more widespread on the occasions that they do happen. Also, they have reduced the variety of plants to only those that are most profitable. So we're not really, like, as humans, we're really not getting the same kind of variety that we used to prior to like mass agriculture. But an upside is that there's also potential for nutrition enhancement. So what these GMOs are starting to move into now is increasing the like the vitamins that are within some of these fruits and vegetables, which is pretty incredible. So if we look at this here in terms of looking at GMOs, so these are some different plants that we have here that are GMO plants. And these stand for different things. So IR stands for insect resistant. So that plant is more tolerant to different insects, as well as HT, herbicide tolerant. So that means that they can use herbicides to deal with, problems within their crop. The DT is drought tolerant. So that is also making them more viable, and as well as VR, virus resistant. So these different diseases and viruses that can affect plants, once they're genetically modified, then that makes them a lot more durable. I guess also, just for me to quickly mention, GMOs get a bad rap. There's been no studies that actually link them to health issues. There are other challenges to them, not so much like how they affect human health. Fertilizers and pesticides. This one is a little bit more straightforward. So these fertilizers and pesticides, they help to produce these crops. But in terms of downside, these are chemicals that are polluting the water and soil. So runoff when it rains, and these chemicals that are on these crops, they run down into different rivers and bodies of water, even oceans, and pollute water sources. It also causes acidification and mineral depletion of soil over time. Pesticides are also harmful to the environment. Again, the same issue of runoff. And then also when they're hand sprayed like this, it's not as big of an issue, but when they're sprayed by huge trucks and then also planes, crop dust, that causes even more environmental issues to local animal populations and also different insects that are good for us and for the biodiversity of the area. And they can harm beneficial microorganisms, so things that are within the soil. So these have led to food movements, kind of like a reaction to a social reaction and political reaction to certain challenges of agriculture and farming. So farming practices done in local and urban environments, that is urban farming. So this is one movement that we're seeing. In developing countries and developed countries, we see these in two different ways. So in developing countries, these are ways to address food insecurity. So having your own gardens within an urban environment helps to provide food for you. It can also create additional jobs in cities to help cultivate some of these urban farms. And one downside is that it can cause issues with local water supplies. So similar to the previous slide that we were just on. In developed countries, we see kind of a different form of urban farming in that it's more of a hobby, right? It also provides fresh produce to impoverished areas. So like urban areas that are maybe, have less income. That's one way that they can have access to fresh produce. And we see this being reflected in zoning laws to support this activity. So cities are now allowing people to have like small farm animals like chickens on their properties. Organic farming. This is another movement that we're seeing in response to certain agricultural issues and practices. So this is the production of crops without using chemicals in order to promote personal and environmental health. So like I mentioned earlier, there are no studies that specifically link GMOs to being unhealthy or to health issues. That is more of a myth, at least at this point. But organic farming just means that they're using less chemicals, which means that there's less exposure leading to health issues. So that means for the farmers and for the surrounding communities, the less chemicals, really the better for them. Also, there's less pollution within the air, soil, and water. And organic meats mean that growth hormones are not used on these animals, and neither are antibiotics. So just like when people get sick, we use antibiotics. Sometimes when animals get sick, they use antibiotics too. So having organic meat means that those animals were not treated with antibiotics if they were to get sick. And fair trade. So this is another food movement that we see and one that we've already touched on. So again, it helps to balance this idea of equity, especially between developing and developed countries. These practices are meant to protect workers, and there needs to be certain standards met in order to be considered fair trade. So these down here, which we went over last time, or I think 2 objectives ago, are the principles of fair trade. And then local food. So local food movements, this is often centered around something called CSAs, community supported agriculture. And essentially it's this idea that sourcing food locally is more sustainable for the environment and the economy, which is absolutely true. So these are very conscious efforts in order to do this. So community supported agriculture is beneficial for farmers and consumers. It reduces the resources needed for transportation. So instead of importing things that are grown in a totally different country or even in a different area of the world, it keeps your food local. Usually it's associated with organic and humane methods for plants and animals, and CSA farmers see a larger percentage of the profits. So there's no like middleman to eat up some of the profits. So the farmers that are doing the actual work, they see more income, which is a very positive thing. So these are a couple of diagrams here that kind of walk you through that process of CSAs. So people are actually connected and meet the farmers. They buy a share of the produce up front. So then the farmer then gets to use that income to invest in their crop for that year, which is a huge expense that farmers have to put forth themselves. So instead, this is more like a community expense and then community benefit. So as the food is growing, then they typically receive like boxes of the produce every week or every couple weeks, whatever their agreement is. So it really connects people to their food and that process. Finally, we have dietary shifts. So there have been changes in demand for types of agricultural products, and also diets have shifted agricultural practices. We see this more so in developed countries. So a few trends. One, white meat is in more demand than red meat. So that red meat consumption has been going down. That has to do with like studies for health and what that means for your own personal like healthy choices, as well as like the taxing nature of growing, or I guess raising red meat on the environment. Also, milk consumption has decreased in place of other milk alternatives. And then also potato demand has increased while rice decreased while rice has increased. So, which also is a more sustainable practice. So challenges to feeding our global population. That's what we're going to go through next. And we have this, sorry guys, overarching idea of food security. So food security, you absolutely have to know this for the exam. This is when all people at all times, that's this right here, have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So there's 4 tenets that come along with food security. That includes availability, access, and utilization, and all that is supported by stability. All of the availability has to be stable, access has to be stable, utilization has to be stable in order for it to be long-term food security. So I just moved myself. I suggest that you guys pause this, read through these different tenets, and overall, and right now we're going to go through some of the other elements of food security. So one danger to food security is something called food deserts. So food deserts occur when an area does not have access to affordable, healthy food options due to a lack of access to supermarkets. So places might have convenience stores available or like fast food available, but those are not considered like healthy options. And sometimes those are kind of expensive. So there are populations that are in food deserts that tend to experience higher rates of health issues like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And we see this in many places, including in developed countries like the US. So these are some examples of food deserts in the US. I'm from down here, so we do see somewhat of a food desert in certain areas, even in the area where I grew up. But people might live in highly urban spaces and maybe don't have a car or don't have access to be able to like get fresh food on a regular basis, then that would be considered a food desert. So challenges to food security. We have transportation and distribution, adverse weather, and suburbanization. So for transportation and distribution, it's not even so much about being able to grow enough food for the population of the world. We can do that. Like we are able to grow food for 8 billion people. However, it's more so transportation and distribution that's the issue. So food spoils if it's not stored properly, which means that in that transportation process, it could spoil. Transportation infrastructure lacks in developing countries. So there are communities that just are not well connected enough in order to receive food shipments. That is a big challenge for developing countries. Governmental policies need to align with creating access to food. So ensuring that there's healthy food, addressing things like food deserts is important for governments to be able to do. Another one is adverse weather. So when we see droughts, storms, freezes, even hail, like hail is not a good thing for crops. It can destroy crops. That puts food in danger, right? Like, and if you don't have that food supply, then your food security is a concern. Also, climate change is increasing this concern. And then finally, suburbanization. So this has to do with our land use. So as cities expand, land use shifts from agriculture to either residential or commercial purposes. Also, prices of land increase as cities expand, causing farms to get priced out. So if farmers are renting land, that cost is going to be increasing as cities expand outward and get closer and closer to that farmland, which kind of pushes them out. Or you see maybe developers offering to purchase their land in order to make different, maybe like housing or maybe a shopping center. So that is money up front that is hard for farmers to say no to, or for anybody to say no to. So this is something that is also challenging our food security. So these are all the things you guys need to know for 5.11, and I will see you guys in 5.12 for our last objective of this unit.